Hello, this is Dr. Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at the Friends of Europe think tank in Brussels, and welcome to this first in our new series of Keeping Our Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. In any crisis, there are those issues where we need to ask ourselves some more critical questions and other issues that we might be neglecting. And if we don't pay attention to them, they could easily bounce back to bite us. And therefore today, I want to highlight first an issue that we need to think more about, which is China. Has China had a good or bad crisis so far since the outbreak of COVID-19? At first sight, it may seem that China has not been having such a comfortable time. It's been accused of delaying the announcements of the virus last year to the World Health Organization, itself losing a month before instituting a lockdown in Wuhan and letting the virus spread, and not providing samples of the virus to the global health organizations for analysis and a search for a vaccine. Another thing that China has been criticized for is spreading a great deal of fake news and propaganda. Somewhat new for China because its soft power up to now has always been based on the notion that it produced a more positive narrative of its role in the world, particularly its peaceful rise. But in accusing the United States military of being behind the virus or that the virus was incubated in Western laboratories, it has done itself no favors. All the more so as it seems to have been aping Russian fake news and propaganda techniques. Finally, it's been reacting rather aggressively to some of the accusations made against it, particularly on the fake news front. Most recently, for example, it's been alleged that China has been putting pressure on the European Union to water down the report on China's disinformation activities since the crisis began. But if we step away for a moment, China could end up being the victor of the COVID-19 crisis. Its economy is likely to take a hit, 6 to 7% of GDP, but to be the first to bounce back from the crisis. And therefore, other countries, particularly in the West with their enormous financial deficits, are going to need Chinese cooperation, Chinese investment, the access to the Chinese market, if they're going to be able to jumpstart their own economies and begin to get those deficits down. The crisis has shown once more that China is really the world's production site when it comes to things like medicines and personal protective clothing. And without being able to access these from China, our own health services run into trouble very quickly indeed. And China may be, who knows, the first country to develop a reliable vaccine, and we will need its cooperation even more. So it strikes me that together with the criticism of China, we need to think very carefully how we balance that with the ability to engage China and to continue to cooperate with it. Not so easy with some of the rhetoric that's flying around at the moment, but think also of one other thing, that if China emerges quickly from the crisis and is therefore able to maintain its high level of defense spending, whereas the Western countries have to drastically reduce their defense spending in order to balance their budgetary books, then that could give China an even more important geostrategic role in the 21st century. So how to be tough on China while at the same time cooperating? We really need answers for that. The second issue, which I want to highlight this week, is what's going on in the Middle East. The answer is many, many bad things. Those of you who remember the famous film The Godfather will remember Al Pacino, the main actor in that movie, at one stage saying that every time he tries to leave the mafia, it sucks him back in. And the same could be said about Western policy, always trying unsuccessfully to disengage from the Middle East. But the indicators are bad throughout the region. The war in Syria is going on with continued violence. Iran is flexing its muscles and has just launched a military satellite in space and is being threatening to American ships in the Gulf. The United States is even now threatening more sanctions against Iran and may soon engage the European countries on that. Meanwhile, in Yemen, the Southern Transitional Council has broken away from its coalition with the government of President Hadi and announced that it wants to take over in Aden. So the war in Yemen may well become even more complicated. Meanwhile, Israel is threatening to move ahead and annex the settlements on the West Bank, even though we all thought that that was meant to be part of a final peace agreement with the Palestinians. And in Afghanistan, the agreement that the United States signed with the Taliban back in February shows signs of unraveling as there's no ceasefire. The talks on reconciliation between the Taliban and the government have not yet started, and the violence has produced already 800 civilian deaths and casualties over the last 3 weeks alone. And should I talk about Libya? Yes, I will, finally, because it's clear that, again, contrary to our hopes and expectations, the agreement on an arms embargo and a ceasefire in Libya is not holding either. So we risk coming out of the crisis not only with worsening geopolitical relations, but with a much more complicated situation in the Middle East. Our governments, of course, have got a lot on their plates handling COVID, but they badly need to devote some diplomatic time to the question of how we keep the channels open with China and how we prevail on the Middle East not to become worse than it already is. Thank you very much for your attention.